7-year-old German Shepherd limped through a night of cold rain and wind, forcing his way into a hospital where no one believed hope still existed. Inside the ICU, John Miller, a legendary U.S. Army veteran, lay motionless after 2 months in a coma, declared lost to the world, his heart barely holding on. Doctors were preparing for the end. His family was told to let go. But they didn't see the shadow slipping past the security door. They didn't hear the quiet pause on the hospital floor. And when that dog climbed onto the bed and called out with a command from a lifelong past, something impossible happened. This is not a story about medicine. It's a story about loyalty, memory, and the moment a soul chooses to stay. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if you believe that some bonds are stronger than death itself, subscribe now, because what you're about to witness may change the way you see miracles forever. Rain battered the city of Portland as autumn storms tore through Oregon, flooding streets, rattling windows, and washing the night in a relentless gray that felt heavy enough to drown memory itself. The German Shepherd moved through the downpour like a shadow stitched together by stubborn will. He was 7 years old, though no record existed to prove it, only the wear in his joints, the silver threading his muzzle, and the way his left hind leg dragged slightly when exhaustion caught him. His coat, once black and rich tan, was matted with rain and road grime. Ribs faintly visible beneath skin stretched too tight from weeks of hunger. Yet his amber eyes were clear, alert, burning with purpose. This was not the look of a stray searching for food. This was the look of a soldier trying to report for duty. The Veterans Affairs Hospital loomed ahead, all concrete and glass, a sterile fortress lit by fluorescent indifference. Automatic doors hissed open for no one, certainly not for dogs, but the shepherd did not hesitate. He circled the building despite the pain flaring up his leg, guided by instinct and something deeper than smell. Memory, habit, loyalty that had nowhere else left to go. He found a side entrance where staff came and went beneath an awning slick with rain. When the door cracked open for a nurse hurrying inside, the dog slipped through low and silent, rainwater dripping from his fur onto polished floors. Inside, warmth hit him like a blow. He staggered briefly, paws skidding on tile, breath coming fast. The hospital smelled of antiseptic, latex, old coffee, and sickness, but underneath it all was something familiar. Leather, oil, metal, a man. The shepherd shook once, water sprang, then limped forward, nails clicking softly as he followed the scent down dim corridors. He avoided voices, tucked himself into shadows when footsteps approached. His body remembered this kind of place: hallways, orders, waiting. The intensive care unit was quieter than the rest of the building, as if sound itself had been trained to keep distance. Inside room 314 lay John Miller. John Miller was 70 years old, though age sat on him unevenly. His face was sharply cut, cheekbones pronounced beneath pale skin that had lost its color during 2 months of immobility. A thick white beard framed his mouth, trimmed short out of habit even when he could no longer lift a hand. His hair, once dark and disciplined, now lay thin and silver against his scalp. Even unconscious, there was a tension in his jaw, a rigid set that spoke of command, of decades spent giving orders that were obeyed without question. John had been a U.S. Army legend, decorated, feared, respected, but now he lay motionless beneath white sheets, chest rising and falling only because a machine insisted that it should. The stroke had come without warning. Massive. Devastating. 2 months earlier, doctors had spoken in clipped, cautious tones. Deep coma. Severe neurological damage, minimal chance of meaningful recovery. That afternoon, the language had changed. Persistent vegetative state, long-term care, acceptance. The shepherd stopped at the doorway. He did not rush forward. He stood there, rainwater pooling beneath him, ears lifted, nostrils flaring. The smell was weaker now, diluted by plastic tubing and medication, but it was unmistakable. The man on the bed was the one from memory, not as he was now, but as he had been. A hand breaking bread cleanly in half. A voice that never shouted, yet carried authority. A presence that did not demand obedience, only respect. The dog crossed the threshold. No alarm sounded. No one noticed the muddy paw prints appearing one by one on the sterile floor. The shepherd approached the bed slowly, reverently, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter something fragile and unseen. He lifted his head, resting his chin lightly against the mattress. His breath fogged the air. His body trembled, partly from cold, partly from something dangerously close to hope. At first, nothing happened. Machines continued their steady hum. Lines on monitors crawled forward without interest. John Miller did not stir. His face remained carved from stone. Then the shepherd shifted his weight and placed one paw gently on the sheet near John's hand. The heart monitor hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, enough to be noticed, not enough to be believed. The green line wavered, dipped, then resumed its rhythm slightly faster than before. The shepherd froze, eyes locked on the man's face. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply stayed. Outside, thunder rolled across the city, shaking the building's bones. Inside room 314, something small but undeniable had changed. Minutes later, a nurse passing the central station frowned at the monitor. She leaned closer, eyes narrowing, fingers tapping the screen as if it might confess to an error. The numbers were subtle but real. She checked the chart, then the doorway, then the muddy paw prints leading into the room. The chart did not list a dog. The patient had no registered visitors. Yet the biological response was undeniable. And somewhere beneath the machines and the rain, something long thought unreachable had stirred. Morning arrived without mercy. The rain had softened into a cold, steady drizzle, tapping against the hospital windows like impatient fingers, while inside the ICU, the light remained harsh and unchanging, bleaching every shadow, every emotion, down to something clinical and manageable. David Miller stood at the foot of his father's bed with his hands clasped behind his back, a posture learned long ago and never quite unlearned. He was 42, tall and broad-shouldered like his father had been in his prime. But where John Miller's frame had carried power, David's carried tension. His dark hair was cropped short and already thinning at the temples. His beard trimmed close, not out of style, but control. He dressed simply, gray jacket, dark jeans, boots polished but worn, like a man who wanted to disappear into the background of responsibility. His face was sharply angled, jaw clenched so tightly it ached, eyes a muted hazel that rarely revealed what he felt. David was not cruel. He was exhausted. Years of living under the shadow of a legendary father had taught him one thing above all else. Hope was dangerous. He did not look at the dog at first. Instead, David focused on the papers resting on the rolling tray beside the bed. The forms were crisp, official, stamped with authority. Long-term care transfer, extended neurological custodial facility. Words designed to sound merciful while quietly closing doors. He had read them 3 times already, each sentence carving a deeper groove into his chest. 2 months, no meaningful response, poor prognosis. The doctors had been gentle but firm. David had learned long ago that firmness was the only language that kept grief from swallowing him whole. John Miller lay unchanged. His white beard framed a face that seemed carved from something older than bone, and even in unconsciousness his brow carried the faint furrow of command. Machines breathed for him. Monitors watched for signs he could no longer give on his own. David stared at his father's hands, those hands that had once lifted him effortlessly, that had taught him how to hold a rifle, how to stand straight, how not to cry in front of other men. Now they lay open and still, useless as tools abandoned in the rain. That was when the low sound started. It was not loud, not sudden, a vibration more than a noise, rising from the floor near the bed. David looked down. The German Shepherd had moved closer during the night. The dog sat now beside the bed, spine straight despite the stiffness in his hind leg, amber eyes fixed on David with unsettling intensity. His fur had dried unevenly, curling slightly along his neck and shoulders, revealing old scars beneath the coat, thin white lines half hidden by time. His muzzle was flecked with gray, and his ears were upright, alert, disciplined. This was not the posture of a frightened animal. It was a warning. The growl deepened when David took a step forward. "Easy," David said quietly, lifting one hand, palm outward. His voice was calm, measured, the way he spoke to volatile donors, difficult doctors, frightened family members. "I'm not here to hurt him." The dog did not move. His lips did not curl. But the sound continued, steady and controlled, vibrating through the room like a distant engine. David felt irritation spike through his exhaustion. "This is a hospital," he muttered, glancing toward the door. "You can't be in here." The shepherd's gaze flicked briefly to John, then back to David, as if measuring him against something invisible and finding him lacking. Before David could call for staff, the door opened. Mary Collins stepped inside, her shoes silent on the floor. She was in her late 50s, tall and lean, with steel-gray hair pulled into a tight bun that never came loose no matter how long the shift. Her skin was weathered in the way of someone who had spent decades under fluorescent lights and emotional strain. Her eyes sharp, observant, kind, but not indulgent. Mary had been an ICU nurse for over 30 years, long enough to recognize patterns that charts did not capture. She had buried a husband who came back from war different and had learned to read silence as fluently as speech. Her gaze went first to the monitor, then to David, and finally to the dog. "Mr. Miller," she said evenly, "you're here early." David exhaled slowly. "I need to sign the transfer papers." Mary did not react immediately. She studied the monitor again, her brow tightening almost imperceptibly. The heart rate was slightly elevated from baseline, not dramatic, but not nothing. "And the dog?" she asked. "He shouldn't be here," David replied. "This isn't safe, for my father or anyone else." Mary's eyes shifted back to the shepherd. The moment her gaze met his, the growl ceased. The dog's posture relaxed by a fraction, though he did not look away from John. His tail lay still against the floor, calm, grounded. Mary noticed something else. When she stepped closer to the bed, the dog did not react at all. When David shifted his weight forward again, the growl returned instantly. Mary straightened. She had seen fear responses before. This wasn't fear. This was recognition. David reached for the pen. The shepherd stood, muscles tensing, nails clicking once against the tile. The sound echoed louder than it should have. "That's enough," David snapped, fatigue finally cracking his restraint. "Get this animal out of here." Mary did not move. Instead, she looked directly at David for the first time, her voice low but firm. "Your father's vitals have been more stable since last night. David froze. "What?" Mary gestured subtly toward the dog. "Since he arrived." The shepherd lowered himself back to a seated position beside the bed, his body angled toward John, his eyes no longer on David at all. Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The dog did not belong to any patient. That much the system confirmed. But whatever he was doing here, it was not random. And whatever he sensed in David, it was not aggression. It was history. Mary stepped back toward the door, already making a decision she knew would complicate everything. "Give me a moment before you sign anything," she said quietly. "Just a moment." David stared at the papers, the pen hovering in his hand, while beside him the dog remained perfectly still, guarding something neither of them fully understood. Mary Collins did not sleep after her shift ended. She went home, showered, the smell of antiseptic from her skin, brewed coffee she barely tasted, and returned to the hospital before dawn with a decision already forming. Experience had taught her that when something felt wrong, it was usually because someone had made it that way on paper. The records room was quiet at that hour, lit by a single row of humming fluorescents. Mary moved with the economy of someone who had learned not to ask permission when lives were balanced on margins. She logged into the archival system and searched John Miller's service history, not the medical file, but the personnel attachments that administrators rarely read unless forced to. The deeper folders resisted at first, access restricted, but Mary knew which codes still worked from the years before digital housekeeping became fashionable. She found the annex labeled Canine Operations and felt a tightening in her chest. 7 years earlier, John Miller had commanded a joint training and reconnaissance program that paired infantry officers with German shepherds bred and trained for scent work, patrol, and psychological stabilization in high-stress environments. The notes were sparse, written in the language of efficiency. Successful deployments, commendations, operational cohesion. Then a red flag. Incident report. Training facility closure. The summary spoke of a failed night exercise, a handler injured, a dog deemed non-compliant under stress. The dog's name appeared once and only once in the formal record, Max. No photograph attached. No disposition date beyond a vague administrative term, reassigned pending evaluation. Mary leaned back, studying the screen. In her 30 years, she had learned what pending often meant when budgets tightened and programs dissolved. It meant forgotten. She printed the report and returned to ICU just as the morning staff gathered. David Miller stood outside his father's room, jacket slung over one arm, eyes red-rimmed with a fatigue that came from arguing with yourself all night. He looked older in daylight, the lines around his mouth deeper than they had been the day before. Mary approached him quietly and held out the papers. "I found something," she said. David took them, his hands steady in a way that suggested practice. He read quickly, then more slowly, then stopped altogether. His jaw tightened, and a memory surfaced uninvited. A conference room 7 years ago, beige walls, the smell of burnt coffee, a civilian contractor explaining costs with a voice too smooth to trust. David had been younger then, newly assigned as a liaison, eager to prove he could be decisive without his father's shadow looming behind him. The form had been simple: transfer approval. He remembered signing it with relief, believing he had chosen the kindest option offered. Humane processing. Placement review. Words that felt merciful enough to end the discussion. "I thought they euthanized him," David said finally, his voice flat. "That's what they said would happen if reassignment failed." Mary studied his face. He was not lying. He was remembering. "There's no record of euthanasia," she replied. "No vet confirmation. No date, just silence. A low sound drifted from the room behind them. The German Shepherd lay beside John's bed, head resting on the mattress, eyes half closed. In daylight, his age showed more clearly. The gray at his muzzle was honest, earned. Old scars marked his shoulder and flank, pale lines beneath fur that had once been meticulously groomed. His left hind leg trembled occasionally, a remnant of an injury that had healed without proper care. Yet his posture remained disciplined, as if his body still answered commands his world had stopped giving. David stepped closer, cautiously. The dog opened one eye, regarded him, then returned his gaze to John without sound. No growl this time, no warning, just refusal. Mary watched the exchange, filing it away. Recognition did not always announce itself loudly. She followed another lead before her shift ended, calling a name buried in the report: Thomas Reed, former Canine Unit Coordinator. The call reached a man in his late 60s with a voice worn thin by cigarettes and regret. He spoke slowly, choosing words like stones placed across water. The facility had been shut down in a hurry, he said. Funding pulled, contracts canceled, dogs relocated where possible. Some were loaded into transport trucks bound for regional shelters under temporary numbers. Max had been one of them. Not aggressive, not broken, just inconvenient. A clerical error lost his tag between transfers. After that, there was nothing to track. He waited, Reed added, after a pause. Some of them do, at the gate, at the door. You tell them it's time to go, and they don't understand why the order doesn't come. Mary thanked him and hung up. The pieces aligned with a cruel simplicity. Max had not died. He had been erased. When Mary returned to the room, David was sitting in the chair by the bed, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He looked smaller there, stripped of the authority the papers had given him. He trusted me to choose, David said, eyes fixed on the floor. I chose to believe them. Max lifted his head and placed it gently against John's forearm. The monitor ticked upward by a single beat, then settled. David noticed. So did Mary. You didn't kill him, Mary said quietly, but you believed a system that made it easy not to ask where responsibility ended. David nodded once. The admission cost him something, but it also steadied him. He reached out slowly, palm open, and stopped inches from the dog's shoulder. Max did not flinch. He did not move closer either. He stayed, watchful, as if waiting for an order that would not come from David. The truth settled between them with the weight of rain on glass. Max had survived by accident. John had been protected by memory, and David, who had signed a paper 7 years earlier, now understood that mercy without vigilance was only another form of abandonment. Mary folded the report and slipped it into the chart, knowing it would complicate everything that followed. The system might prefer clean endings, but life had a way of returning what had been discarded. Max remained beside the bed, calm and immovable, a presence the records had failed to erase. By late afternoon, the rain returned with purpose. It streaked the windows in slanted lines, blurring the city into a smear of gray and steel, as if the world outside the hospital were slowly dissolving. Inside, however, order was tightening, not around healing, but around rules. The decision came from above, carried down corridors by clipped voices and folded arms. Hospital administration had reviewed the incident reports, the security footage, the complaints logged quietly by staff uneasy with precedent. Animals were not permitted in ICU. Exceptions did not exist. Not for loyalty, not for coincidence, not for a dog whose presence could not be explained by policy. The order was clear. The dog would be removed. Dr. Alan Brooks was the one sent to deliver it. He was in his early 50s, tall and spare, with a long face etched by permanent concern lines between his brows. His dark hair had receded just enough to make him self-conscious, and he compensated with precision, perfect posture, perfect diction, perfect emotional distance. Brooks was a cardiologist by training, respected for his methodical approach and his refusal to let sentiment cloud clinical judgment. Years earlier, he had lost a patient after bending protocol for a family's request, and the reprimand that followed had reshaped him. Since then, rules were safety. Rules were survival. Mary Collins stood beside John Miller's bed as Brooks entered, tablet in hand. The room felt smaller suddenly, compressed by intent. Max lay on the floor near the bed, eyes open, ears alert. He did not rise, but his body shifted subtly, weight coiling into readiness. "This can't continue," Brooks said, voice even. "I understand the emotional component, but ICU protocol is non-negotiable." Mary did not argue immediately. She watched the monitor. John's heart rate was steady, stronger than it had been in weeks. Oxygen saturation held. Subtle improvements, yes, but real. "You've seen the data," Mary replied. "You know there's correlation." Brooks exhaled through his nose. "Correlation isn't causation." David Miller stood near the door, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. His face was drawn, the lines carved deeper by a night without rest and a morning without answers. The truth uncovered in the records room still echoed in him, heavy and unresolved. He looked at Max, then at his father, then back to Brooks. "If removing him makes things worse—" "We can't base medical decisions on intuition," Brooks cut in gently but firmly. "We'll monitor closely. If there's instability, we intervene." Max stood. The movement was quiet but deliberate. He placed himself between the bed and Brooks, not aggressive, not defiant, simply present. His amber eyes did not flicker. His scarred shoulder caught the light, a reminder of work done long before this room existed. Brooks stiffened. "Security," he said into his tablet. Mary's jaw tightened. She crouched slightly, meeting Max's gaze. "Easy," she whispered. "I know." Two security officers arrived moments later. They were younger men, broad and awkward in the way of people unused to rooms where life hovered on wires. One reached for a leash, hesitating when Max did not retreat. "Let me," David said suddenly. He stepped forward, slow and open-handed. Max's eyes tracked him, calculating. The dog did not growl this time, but neither did he yield. David stopped a foot away. "I'm not sending you away forever," David said quietly, words more for himself than the dog. "Just not right now." Max looked past him, to John. The separation was not violent. It was worse than that. It was orderly. Hands guided Max gently but firmly toward the door. His nails scraped once against the tile, a sound that cut through the room sharper than any alarm. As he crossed the threshold, he turned his head, ears pinned back, not in fear, but in protest. The door closed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then John Miller's heart rate spiked. The monitor's rhythm broke its pattern, stuttering into chaos. The steady line jagged upward, then dipped dangerously low. An alarm screamed, sharp and unforgiving. Mary was already moving, calling out numbers, reaching for medication. Brooks snapped into action, all hesitation burned away by necessity. "VFib," Mary said. "He's crashing." David froze, the sound drilling into him. He watched his father's chest shudder under intervention, watched strangers fight a battle he had believed was already lost. Outside the room, Max barked once, deep, urgent, unmistakably trained. The sound carried through the door like a command echoing down a corridor. "Bring the dog back," Mary shouted without thinking. Brooks hesitated for half a second, a lifetime in medicine. Then he nodded sharply. "Now." The door opened. Max surged forward, slipping past hands meant to restrain him. He leapt onto the bed with a precision that defied panic, planting his weight carefully, chest aligned with John's. His body vibrated, not with fear, but with focus. The monitor lurched again, then steadied. The erratic spikes softened. The rhythm found its way back. Silence fell, broken only by the machine's measured beeping. Brooks stared at the screen, then at the dog, then at John, his face drained of certainty. "That's not possible," he murmured. Mary straightened slowly, heart pounding. "It just happened." David sank into the chair, hands over his mouth, eyes burning. The truth landed fully now, undeniable and terrifying in its simplicity. Removing Max had nearly killed his father. An hour later, the Emergency Medical Review Board convened in a small glass-walled room. Charts were displayed, footage replayed, times were logged. The evidence spoke in numbers and seconds, immune to disbelief. Reluctantly, carefully, the conclusion formed. Max was not a visitor. He was a variable holding John Miller at the edge of life. And separating them again might push him over. The rain had thinned into a gray mist by evening, clinging to the hospital like a memory that refused to fade. And inside the administrative wing, the air felt heavier than it had any right to be. Mary Collins walked beside David Miller toward a small conference room usually reserved for ethics reviews. Her stride steady, her expression set in the quiet determination of someone who had learned that truth rarely announced itself kindly. David followed half a step behind, shoulders slumped, the confidence he wore in public stripped away by exhaustion and something closer to shame. The file Mary carried was thin, which troubled her more than a thick one would have. Thin files meant omissions, and omissions were often deliberate. She placed it on the table beneath the harsh ceiling light and opened it without ceremony. Inside were supplemental notes attached to John Miller's military medical history, documents that had never been merged into his civilian chart. David leaned forward, reading slowly, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. 7 years earlier, John Miller had served on an oversight panel reviewing a proposed partnership between a private defense-linked medical corporation and a regional veterans healthcare network. The corporation's name surfaced repeatedly, Halcyon Advanced Systems. The notes described them in the language of compliance, innovative, well-funded, strategically aligned. But Mary had learned to read past adjectives. Halcyon promised state-of-the-art stroke response units, faster triage, proprietary neurological protocols. What they asked for in return was influence, data access, preferential contracting, quiet control over post-acute care. John Miller had refused. Mary explained it calmly, pointing to timestamps and signatures. "Your father objected on ethical grounds. He believed the protocols prioritized cost containment over individual care, especially for older veterans with complex histories." David swallowed. He remembered that period now, his father becoming suddenly distant, guarded, the arguments at family dinners that ended in silence. John had never raised his voice, but disappointment carried more weight than anger ever could. "He filed a formal dissent," Mary continued, "and he shielded junior officers who were pressured to endorse the deal, took the heat himself." David sat back, running a hand through his hair. "Halcyon still operates in this state," he said quietly. "Yes," Mary replied, "and they hold advisory influence here." Another knock sounded at the door before David could respond. A woman entered without waiting for permission, heels clicking softly against the floor. She was in her early 40s, tall and elegantly slim, with straight chestnut hair cut just below the jaw and skin that spoke of careful maintenance rather than sun. Her eyes were a cool slate blue, assessing, practiced. She wore a tailored navy coat despite the hour, and when she smiled, it did not reach her eyes. Sarah Whitcomb, she said smoothly, extending a hand toward David. I represent Halcyon's regional interests. David hesitated, then shook her hand out of reflex. Her grip was firm, controlled. I heard there was some concern about Mr. Miller's care, Sarah continued, taking a seat uninvited. Her voice was calm, reassuring, the tone of someone accustomed to diffusing conflict before it became inconvenient. I wanted to clarify that all procedures followed accepted guidelines. Mary watched her closely. Sarah's posture was relaxed, but her gaze flicked repeatedly to the file on the table. She knew exactly what they were discussing. The guidelines allowed a delay, Mary said evenly. They did not require one. Sarah inclined her head slightly, a gesture that mimicked understanding without conceding anything. In emergency medicine, resources are finite. Triage decisions are made constantly. David's chest tightened. He remembered the night of the stroke now with sudden clarity. The phone call that came late, the vague language, the reassurance that his father was stable, being monitored. He remembered trusting that reassurance because it was easier than driving across the city, easier than demanding answers. How long was the delay? David asked. Sarah's smile thinned. Minutes, she said, within permissible limits. Mary slid another page across the table. 26 minutes, she corrected, during a critical window. The room fell silent. Outside, thunder rolled distantly, echoing the weight of the moment. That delay, Mary continued, was justified under Halcyon's risk-adjusted response model. Older patient, complex history, lower projected recovery index. David felt something fracture inside him. He saw himself again, 7 years younger, signing papers he barely read, believing systems existed to protect people like his father. He saw the pen hovering over the transfer forms yesterday, his hand steady because it was easier not to feel. You didn't kill him, Mary said softly, sensing his spiral. But you didn't speak when it mattered. Sarah rose smoothly, gathering her coat. This conversation is unproductive, she said, composure intact. Mr. Miller's condition is unfortunate, but no wrongdoing occurred. She left without waiting for a response. David stared at the closed door, his reflection faint in the glass. For the first time, the truth settled fully into him, heavy and unavoidable. His father had stood alone against a system designed to look benevolent while rationing compassion, and when the moment came that required someone else to stand with him, David had chosen silence. Back in the ICU, Max lay beside John's bed, his breathing slow, steady. The dog lifted his head as David entered, eyes meeting his without hostility. David stepped closer, lowering himself into the chair. He reached out, hesitated, then rested his hand lightly on Max's shoulder. The dog did not move away. I should have been here, David whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The monitor ticked softly, John's heart holding its fragile line. The truth did not heal anything yet, but it changed who would speak next. The rain returned with violence just after midnight, hammering the hospital roof like fists on steel, the kind of storm that rattled nerves even inside reinforced walls. In the ICU, fluorescent lights hummed steadily, indifferent to the weather, indifferent to the man whose body was quietly losing its argument with life. John Miller lay motionless, his broad chest barely rising beneath the thin blanket, his once commanding frame reduced to stillness. At 70, the angles of his face were sharp and weathered, a square jaw softened by gray stubble, deep lines carved by decades of command and restraint. For 2 months he had not spoken, not moved, not opened his eyes. But the storm outside seemed to awaken something restless inside the room. Mary Collins stood near the monitor, her posture tense. The lines on the screen flickered irregularly, numbers dipping and rising with growing instability. She had seen this before, too many times. Her dark hair, streaked faintly with silver, was pulled back tight, her tired eyes fixed on the rhythm that was beginning to unravel. She pressed a call button, her voice calm but urgent as she requested backup. David Miller sat at his father's bedside, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. In his early 40s, David was tall and lean, with his father's jawline but none of his certainty. His beard was untrimmed, a sign of days spent sleeping in a chair instead of a bed. Guilt weighed on him heavier than exhaustion. He leaned forward, speaking softly, even though no one believed John could hear him anymore. His voice trembled as he apologized for things he had never dared to say aloud when his father was conscious. Down the hall, behind a secured door meant to enforce policy, Max paced in tight circles. The German Shepherd's coat, once jet black and tan, was dulled by age and hardship, a faint scar cutting through the fur above his left shoulder. At 7 years old, his body still carried strength, but his movements were measured, controlled, the precision of years of training etched into muscle memory. His amber eyes were sharp, alert, fixed on something no human could see. He had been separated from John once already, and every instinct in him screamed that time was running out. The heart monitor sounded a long, continuous tone. Mary spun toward the bed. He's flatlining. Chaos followed in practiced bursts. Nurses moved quickly. A crash cart wheeled in. Gloves snapped on. A physician barked orders as hands pressed against John's chest, compressions beginning with brutal rhythm. David stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat as he watched his father's body jolt under the force meant to bring him back. The storm outside surged louder, rain lashing against the windows as if the world itself were demanding a verdict. In the holding room, Max froze. His ears snapped forward. He did not bark. He did not whine. Instead, he lowered his head, muscles coiling. With a sudden force that surprised even him, he lunged at the door. The latch rattled. Once, twice. A maintenance worker down the hall shouted, startled, but it was too late. The door gave way just enough. Max shoved through, nails scraping against tile as he sprinted toward the ICU. Inside the room, a nurse shouted, "No pulse!" David's knees buckled. Mary felt a familiar, crushing resignation settle in her chest. She had seen men die surrounded by machines, had watched families cling to false hope until the last second was stolen from them. The doors burst open. Max charged in like a force of nature, skidding across the polished floor. He ignored the shouting, ignored the raised hands. His focus was singular. He leapt onto the bed, planting his front paws firmly on John's chest, directly over the failing heart. The room erupted in protest, but no one moved fast enough to stop him. Max's body went rigid. His head lifted, and then he barked. It was not the bark of fear or aggression. It was sharp, controlled, clipped, an unmistakable command, the same tone once used on training fields and battle zones. Sit up. Breathe. Stay with me. The sound cut through the room like a blade. The monitor twitched. A single spike broke the flat line. "Wait!" Mary shouted. "Check the rhythm!" Another bark followed, lower this time, urgent but steady, as if counting time. John's fingers twitched. His chest shuddered beneath Max's paws. The monitor beeped again, then again. A rhythm emerged, weak, uneven, but undeniably there. "I've got a pulse!" a nurse yelled. David collapsed against the wall, sobbing openly now, his hands covering his face as the reality hit him. This was not a miracle in the way stories like to tell it. There was no divine intervention, no rewriting of fate. What returned John to the edge of life was something far more brutal and human: memory. The brain, starved and damaged, had reached for the last command it recognized, the last voice it had trusted. Survival training embedded so deeply it refused to die quietly. Max had not brought John back from death. He had reminded him how not to let go. As the medical team took over, easing Max back, the dog did not resist. He stepped down slowly, standing at attention beside the bed, chest heaving, eyes locked on John's face. The storm outside began to soften, rain easing into a steady whisper. Mary wiped her eyes with the back of her glove. She had spent her career believing in science, in protocols, in data. Tonight, she believed in something else as well. Not magic, not miracles, but the stubborn, terrifying strength of a bond forged when survival once depended on listening to the same voice. Morning arrived quietly, almost apologetically, as if the storm had exhausted itself and now waited to see what remained. Rain still clung to the windows in thin, trembling trails, but the thunder was gone, and a pale gray light filtered into the ICU, softening the hard edges of machines and walls. John Miller's eyes opened without drama. No gasp, no sudden movement, just a slow return, like a man surfacing after being held under too long. His gaze drifted across the ceiling, unfocused at first, then steadier, the way it had once scanned terrain before issuing orders. His breathing was shallow, but his chest rose on its own now, no machine forcing the rhythm. The lines of his face looked deeper, the granite angles worn down by time and pain, but the strength behind them remained. A faint tremor passed through his hand, the one resting near the edge of the bed, and his fingers curled instinctively, searching. "Max," he whispered. The name came out rough, scraped raw by disuse, but it was clear enough to freeze the room. David Miller was sitting nearby, slumped forward in a chair that had bruised his ribs through the night. He was unshaven, his dark hair falling into his eyes, the sharp planes of his face softened by exhaustion and something else, relief edged with fear. When he heard his father speak, he stood too fast, the motion clumsy, like a boy caught off guard. "Dad?" His voice cracked despite his effort to keep it steady. John turned his head slowly toward the sound, his eyes, still clouded at the edges, fixed on David with a calm that unsettled him. There was no accusation there, no anger, just recognition. Max stood at the bedside, his body still, disciplined, the way it had been trained to wait unless commanded otherwise. His coat was damp from the night before, black and tan fur flecked with gray around the muzzle, amber eyes alert but no longer wild. At 7 years old, he carried the quiet authority of something that had survived both use and abandonment. When John's gaze dropped toward him, Max stepped forward without hesitation, placing his head against the bed, exactly where John's hand could reach. John's fingers closed around the fur, slow and deliberate. "Good," he murmured. It was not praise, it was confirmation. Mary Collins watched from the foot of the bed, arms crossed loosely, her shoulders finally lowered after hours of holding tension. In the harsh hospital lighting, her face showed every year she had spent in critical care, fine lines etched by loss, dark circles earned honestly. She had seen recoveries before, but this one felt different. It felt earned. A physician murmured updates into a recorder, noting responsiveness, verbal recognition, stabilized vitals. The language of charts and protocols resumed, but none of it could touch what had just occurred. David swallowed hard and stepped closer. "I'm here," he said, unsure whether to explain himself or ask forgiveness. John's grip on Max tightened slightly, grounding himself before he looked back at his son. "Don't manage me," he said quietly. Each word cost him effort, but he did not rush. "Be my son." The sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. David nodded, tears slipping freely now, not from shame alone, but from the strange relief of being released from a role he had never wanted. He reached out, hesitant, and rested his hand over his father's wrist, feeling warmth where there had been none before. John did not pull away. The days that followed were not miraculous. They were difficult, measured in inches gained and setbacks endured. John learned his body again under the guidance of therapists, who treated him neither like a legend nor a liability. His frame was thinner, his movements slower, but his will remained intact. Max was never far. He walked beside the bed during early sessions, sat patiently during exercises, and positioned himself instinctively between John and doorways, as if guarding not a room, but something more fragile. Staff stopped questioning it after the third day. The data spoke for itself. On the morning of discharge, the rain finally stopped. The sky remained overcast, but the air felt clean, scrubbed of the weight it had carried. John sat in a wheelchair near the exit, dressed in borrowed civilian clothes that hung loosely on him. His beard had been trimmed, revealing the familiar severity of his jaw, though softened now by fatigue. Max stood at his side, leash loose, posture proud. David signed the final paperwork with steady hands this time, no longer trying to control the outcome, only to support it. As they moved toward the doors, John paused, his hand tightening briefly on the armrest. He looked down at Max, who met his gaze without wavering. "You stay," John said softly. It was not a command. It was an invitation. Max responded by sitting, perfectly aligned, eyes forward, ready. Outside, the pavement glistened, reflecting a sky that had not yet decided what it would become. John breathed it in, the smell of wet concrete and distant pine, and felt something inside him settle. He had not returned to life unchanged. Parts of him had been lost, stripped away by silence and neglect. But what remained was enough. As they walked, slowly, carefully, John understood that Max was no longer just a companion or a remnant of duty. He was the gatekeeper, not of buildings or borders, but of a man's will to remain present in a world that had once moved on without him. And this time, John did not intend to be left behind. Sometimes, miracles don't look like lightning or loud prayers. Sometimes, God answers through loyalty, memory, and a heart that refuses to leave. John survived not because of machines alone, but because love reached him when hope was gone. God often sends help in humble forms, through companionship, faithfulness, and beings the world forgets. If this story touched you, remember, you are not alone in your battles. God may already be working quietly in your life. Like this video if you believe in quiet miracles. Share it with someone who needs hope. Comment where you're watching from and who you're praying for. Subscribe for more stories of faith, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, protect you, and walk with you through every storm.